invasion. Yes, I know. It's been universally agreed upon it was a very bad thing. But was it really? I mean, yes, there was certainly a lot that went wrong with it. A lack of star power on the Alliance, the group not being portrayed as a legitimate threat, too much focus on the McMahons. I could go on. In fact, I already did that years ago. It's not a controversial statement to say that on the whole, the invasion was a failure. Hell, those who were in charge at the time would agree. But in wrestling, few things are truly 100% across the board bad. There's almost always a silver lining in even the worst angles and gimmicks. The Diva Search created some of the most interesting female performers for the era. The Spirit Squad gave us Dolph Ziggler. The Brawl for All let us see Bradshaw get his lights knocked out. See, there's good in everything. And as more years have passed and my emotions have mellowed, the more I look back on it, the more I realize, for all its faults and what-ifs, the invasion storyline actually brought us a lot of positives. And this week, I'm going to rank them, the top 8 good things brought to us by the invasion. Number 8. The Rise of Rob Van Dam. For all the talent that was on display during the invasion, very few broke out into superstardom, and that's just for Team WWF. But over in the Alliance, there was one shining beacon. A little bit of a hazy beacon, but a beacon nonetheless. Even more than guys like Booker T, Diamond Dallas Page, or Rhino, RVD became the breakout star of the Alliance. Fans who were already in the know knew that Van Dam lived up to his monikers, but the invasion was a great introduction to fans who hadn't watched ECW. His exciting in-ring exploits were on full display in battles with guys like Jeff Hardy, Chris Jericho, Kurt Angle, and The Undertaker. And despite being on the dark side of the Alliance, his style in the ring and on the microphone made him impossible to hate. For months, fans wanted to see RVD turn his back on Stone Cold and the rest of the Alliance. Even though he never ended up defecting, to see him stand up to and challenge Austin for the title in a triple threat match at No Mercy that year was a huge milestone. Once the invasion angle had wrapped up, RVD's popularity never waned and was a perennial fan favorite for pretty much the duration of his time in the company. His hard work and his connection to the fans was rewarded in 2006 when he beat John Cena to become the WWE Champion. It felt about 3 or 4 years too late and ended far too soon due to his own mistakes, but at the time it was a sweet moment for all of his fans. And for the record, nobody was really going to riot if Cena had retained. Number 7. The Old Stone Cold. More than anything, the invasion storyline was less about match results or compelling storytelling and more about moments. There were a ton of these throughout the invasion, and this one on the Go Home Raw before the invasion pay-per-view was one of the best. By July, WWF champion Steve Austin's on-air character had become a shell of his former self. He was more self-centered, paranoid, and desperate for praise than ever before, and while it sometimes led to some great comedic moments, which we'll talk about later, it was far from the Austin necessary to fight off the WCW-ECW insurgency. On an episode of SmackDown, Vince McMahon publicly begged Austin to bring back the old Stone Cold, the ass-kicking, finger-gesturing Austin of the glory days. But for days, Austin refused, dejected. Then on July 16th on Raw, just when things were looking bleak for Team WWF, the fans finally got what they wanted. The arena exploded as Austin came barreling down the ramp. The swagger, the yelling, the fighting, this is what fans had wanted to see for so long. To see Austin act in a way we hadn't really seen since WrestleMania months earlier was a huge moment in the history of the invasion. It was all for naught when Austin showed his true colors and joined the Alliance 6 days later, but boy did it give fans hope for brighter days ahead. Number 6. Chris Jericho, World Champion. Something that both writers and fans seem to have forgotten in the build to this year's Survivor Series is, it's possible to have brand loyalty and still have issues with people within your own camp. Case in point, Chris Jericho. As summer turned to autumn, Y2J had more or less turned heel by going after then WCW champion The Rock. Despite being a baddie, he never jumped ship to the Alliance, even though others in similar situations did just that with diminishing returns. At No Mercy, the same pay-per-view in which Rob Van Dam got his first shot at the WWF Championship, Jericho shocked the world when he beat The Rock to win the WCW title, his first world championship. This was a big deal for followers of Chris Jericho. It always felt like he'd been on the cusp of world champ status for a long time before the WCW buyout, but that dangling carrot had always been just out of reach. For instance, Jericho was on the early promotional material for WrestleMania 2000, which seemed to imply that he was going to be in that Four Corners match for the title. And let's not forget that infamous bait and switch later that same year, when Jericho pinned Triple H to become the champion, only to have the decision reversed later in the night. So when Jericho beat The Rock and claimed his first of what would become several world titles, it was pure validation. This, of course, paved the way for Chris to become the first ever undisputed champion at Vengeance that December. I seem to recall he beat 2 people in the same night to win it, but God, their names escape me at the moment. Number 5. Shane McMahon buys WCW. Even though it was so far removed from everything else going on in this angle, this still was technically the beginning of the invasion. Nobody, much less the WWF, had a clue where things were going to end up, but this was the moment that started it all. March 26, 2001, Panama City Beach, Florida, the final episode of WCW Nitro. The WWF had purchased WCW for pennies on the dollar after AOL Time Warner decided to pull wrestling from their TV lineup, and it was all over but the shouting. In the middle of Raw, but at the end of Nitro, a first ever simulcast took place, in which Vince McMahon entered the ring in Cleveland, Ohio to gloat about his major accomplishment. But in the middle of his rant, who would show up in Florida but his own son, Shane?
However, the contract reads, Shane McMahon.
Oh my God!
In that iconic split screen, fans witnessed one of the biggest moments in wrestling history when Shane announced he had purchased WCW from under his father's nose, in kayfabe of course. Though it was essentially last-minute window dressing for their already established feud going into WrestleMania 6 days later, it was still totally insane to see anyone from the WWF, much less than McMahon, show up on camera in WCW to make the proclamation. Number 4. The Adventures of Kurt Angle, Steve Austin, and Vince McMahon. I've given flack in the past about Steve Austin's heel turn in 2001. I stand by the fact it was a bad call for him to turn, especially given the timing of The Rock's departure to Hollywood. But looking back at this era, Austin as a full-fledged baddie wasn't without its merits. Well, mostly this. As I mentioned earlier, this version of Austin had become a bit of an ass-kisser, constantly seeking attention from Mr. McMahon. And around the same time, Kurt Angle also wanted attention from Vince, so the two would compete for Mr. McMahon's time in exponentially more hilarious ways, from exchanging gifts to playing the guitar.
Jimmy cracked corn and I don't care. I got Olympic gold. I got Olympic gold.
I'd always been a fan of Kurt Angle's complete obliviousness to his heelish ways in the first couple of years of his run, but having Austin do a similar shtick really elevated both guys, and for Vince to be the straight man in all this madness was the icing on the cake.
Damn it, please! I just got subpoenaed!
Though this beautiful relationship would crumble once Austin joined the Alliance, for as fleeting as it was, this comedic joy from the bionic redneck, the American hero, and the chairman was must-watch stuff. Number 3. Paul Heyman's shoot promo on Vince. When I began watching wrestling in 1998, I didn't know much about Paul Heyman, or as he was known then, Paulie Dangerously. I watched some ECW on TNN, and I saw his infamous shoot promo where he dared the network to take him off the air, which they did, and then I saw him on commentary for the WWF as his company was going under. As the angle went on, I finally learned just how amazing Heyman could be on the microphone, and this is quite possibly his crowning achievement. On the SmackDown Before Survivor series, Heyman stood face-to-face with Vince McMahon in the ring and proceeded to air out years of grievances with the owner of the company. In what must have been some major catharsis for himself, insiders, and hardcore fans, Heyman blistered Vince for several uninterrupted minutes, ranting about his dismantling of the competition, the term sports entertainment, and becoming a billionaire at the expense of others.
You had to have sports entertainment! We had to have sports entertainment! Ha ha ha! You ran all the competition into the ground and you stole all their ideas? And you know whose ideas you stole the most, Vince? You stole mine!
The company had dabbled in worked shoot promos in the past, but nothing like this. Nothing that lobbed direct, pointed, and what many would say truthful attacks at Vince McMahon himself. The promo was an eye-opener for many fans, both in learning some of the seedier history of the company, and as an introduction to just how good of a speaker Heyman was, and still is to this day. It would be the Alliance's final shot before Survivor Series, and it was one that still resonates to this day. Number 2. ECW Joins the Invasion. In my opinion, this was hands down the singular coolest moment of the entire invasion, for all of 20 minutes. On the July 2nd edition of Raw, Booker T and Buff Bagwell shit the bed in Tacoma, Washington, and helped derail the idea of relaunching WCW as its own entity. The following week, however, the invasion got a very interesting new wrinkle. In the middle of a tag team match pitting Kane and Chris Jericho against Lance Storm and Mike Awesome, who the announcers refused to acknowledge as Team Canada, chaos erupted as Rob Van Dam and Tommy Dreamer ran into the crowd and stormed the ring. Out came a bevy of WWF talent, all of whom used to work for ECW, supposedly to save Kane and Jericho. But in a shocking twist, the men turned around and assaulted the babyfaces. Awesome and Storm, also ECW alumni, joined in the battle. Paul Heyman left the announce desk and proclaimed that ECW was now in the mix. Ah yes, that was quite the,
Nerdgasm!
This moment was a huge curveball, one of the few moments in the entire angle that was not only unexpected, but was also interesting and exciting. After Austin's heel turn, we would go on to see many more surprise defections to the Alliance that were underwhelming at best and confusing at worst. And after this ECW moment, those were literally the only things we saw that were considered shocking. But this one stood head and shoulders above everything else. Yes, the moment would be ruined by the end of the night when Stephanie McMahon was declared the new owner of ECW, but man, for that one brief period of time, things were awesome. And the number 1 best thing the invasion storyline brought us is a whole new world of storytelling. So in the end, what was the biggest thing the invasion taught us? Is that given the rights to certain video libraries, WWE can tell amazing stories that they wouldn't be able to otherwise. Yes, over the years there have been some problems with revisionist history about WCW and their contributions to the business, both good and bad. But on the micro level, when talking about individual wrestlers and rivalries, having access to all that WCW footage means you can tell their complete stories without having to gloss over details. Before the buyout, the WWF barely mentioned WCW. If a WCW wrestler had shown up on WWF TV, nobody could talk about what they had accomplished to make them worthy of competing up north, or at least not in much detail. Look at Sting's time in the company a couple of years ago. Had he shown up before 2001, the narrative about him would have been much different than it ended up being. They managed to completely omit a 9-year span of his career, but we'll get to that in a minute. As another example, take a look at the guys who wrestled for TNA for a bit in between WWE runs. According to the official narrative, it's like these guys just disappeared from the sport for several years, sitting at home and doing nothing. And don't even get me started on the company's handling of AJ Styles, where they can only use the 1 or 2 matches he had in WCW in their dying days as evidence of his longevity in wrestling. And then there's Sting from earlier. Think about all that storytelling would change if WWE owned the TNA library. That's basically what happened when WCW was bought out in 2001. Since the invasion, retrospectives have been done on the careers of men who spent lots of time outside of the WWE bubble. Dusty Rhodes, Ric Flair, Steve Austin, Chris Jericho, Sting, Chris Benoit, Eddie Guerrero. Their stories could not have been told if WCW were in the hands of somebody else. Look, I'm not saying the buyout was good for the wrestling business, because it certainly wasn't, but in the grand scheme of things, from the in-ring stuff to beyond, wrestling is all about storytelling. You can't tell the story properly if you don't have all the chapters. And in its own way, for better or for worse, the invasion helped lead the way in telling the story of a pivotal part of the history of the business. So what else do you think belongs in this list? Let me know in the comment section below. Be sure to thumbs up this video if you like it, subscribe to Wrestling with Regret, and buy the t-shirts at ProWrestlingTees.com. I'm Zane, and I'll see you next time.